Hello, everyone. This is Tim. I just wanted to go over a few things. Here's probably my last post for prior to the Christmas holiday, and might make another one before the new year. But we're getting so close to the new year that I wanted to cover this briefly here because of some of the numbers that are coming out now with the jobs report numbers and unemployment and things like that. The chance of a recession next year has gone up to like 30 to 40% at this point, and to a large degree, I think it's actually quite a bit higher than that because I think the jobs numbers are a lot worse than have been reported over the past year. So we're going to get into that shortly. I've got a video and audio I'm going to show here in a minute, which gets into some detail. There's some guys who I follow very closely who are great at analyzing the data, and they come up with charts and numbers and stuff like that. And so they're going to go into that here briefly as far as the job numbers, some of that, and how that looks at this point. But the jobs numbers over the past year have been just atrocious, and it hasn't been reported accurately by the BLS, and so they have underreported how bad the jobs were, and that actually impacted the market. Our interest rate would probably be about 1% lower right now on the 30-year mortgage if it weren't for how badly they've reported these numbers and how far off they have been. But yeah, the chance for recession has gone up to like 30 to 40%, and that's what people are reporting it to be. But I think it is actually more like 60 to 70%, based on what we're seeing in the jobs market and the fact that it's probably going to continue to accelerate and get worse. And so I'm going to go into that here shortly. Let me go ahead and share this audio and video here with you. This is the MBS Highway. This is Barry Habib. He's incredible at analyzing this stuff, and his team. I follow them closely. I pay for their subscription, and they do an amazing job. So no sense for me to recreate what they're doing. So I'm going to go ahead and play some of this video. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's like 10 minutes long, but I'm going to play this part where they get into the jobs numbers, and it's going to make a lot more sense.
The QCEW gave us this report, which is, I think it's just stunning, the amount of discrepancy. I'm not saying it's nefarious, but I'm saying that, boy, there's hopefully should be better ways, and we know where it's coming from. We'll show you where it's coming from. It's the birth-death model, which we've gone over so many times, how flawed it is. It is time for the BLS to revamp this modeling that they use that goes back to 1985. 40 years. It's there are advances that have been happening in the last 40 years. We have modern data. This is the same stuff we go through with the inflation numbers. You hear Fed members obsessing with inflation, but the BLS model is broken. And just how broken is it as far as the job numbers go? Well, let's take a look together. And Dan, I think you'd agree, first off, any first comments before I show the slide, because it's just stunning what is going on here.
It is stunning, and as we'll show, the revisions are getting worse and worse and worse.
And we'll also show you that this is just through Q2 of 2025. I think these discrepancies will accelerate because we've seen more deterioration since Q2 of 2025 into the final 2 quarters of the year. And I think that the numbers are going to actually get worse. Let's show you what we're talking about here. So here's the chart. Let's go over first what we have. So the BLS, they gave some initial numbers for what we were for the 12 months from Q2 of 2024 to Q2 of 2025. So in other words, July of 2024 through June of 2025. So that 12-month period, the BLS initially told us that there was 1.923 million job creations. Then they themselves revised that lower rather significantly, almost 25%. It's a pretty big haircut, where they said their final number was 1.534 million. But the real number, which we get from the QCEW, the real number is not 1.534 million. It is 420,000. Now, that is a whopping overstatement of 1.11 million from the BLS's revised number. That's a 73%. So in other words, 3 out of 4 jobs that the BLS after revisions told us We had 3 out of 4 never happened, evaporated into thin air. The Q1 over Q1 was bad enough where like half of them, but this is showing that 73% never happened. Only 27%, that's final. But if you looked at from their initial report, and why is initial so important? This is what the bond market responded to. This is where you got hammered on your rate sheet. The bond market struggled, and this is why it was so frustrating for us, because they told us they initially reported 1.9 million jobs. It was only 420 over 12 months. That's 35,000 jobs a month is what the real number was. That's an overstatement of 1.5 million jobs. Or put it this way, 78%. That means out of every 5 jobs they told us that we got, there were only 1. 4 were, whatever the error was in the methodology. And Dan, you went over these numbers and you dug deep. Let's talk about the methodology, Dan.
Well, you guys have heard us beat the drum on how this birth-death model is really the main culprit for the revisions. Well, I think this really underscores it. So over that period of time, from 2024 to 2025, from July to June, you had the birth-death account for 1.119 million jobs. And boy, that looks pretty close, almost exact to the overstatement that we saw from the BLS's revised numbers, to comparing that to the actual QCEW numbers. So, this really tells the whole story. But I also want to just show you.
Hold on, Dan. Let's talk about the birth, because I think we should explain this to everybody. Okay, so the BLS, they send out 125,000 surveys to large companies, and that, listen, it's a Herculean effort to get these numbers. So we're not going to beat up on anybody here. It's a tough job to do. But these surveys that come back, maybe they give you medium, large size businesses. But what about your local dry cleaning, your sub shop, all your neighborhood stores, small businesses, which represent, I think we went over these numbers with you, about 47% of those employed. So it's an enormous sector. So they use this birth-death model. And birth refers to businesses being started up or born, and birth, the closures. But closures can tend to unwind. You're letting people go as you're closing them, and maybe there's only one person left when it finally closes, and it could take a long time because of the accounting situations. So you may not get those closures. And when you start up a business, you're going to have fewer employees, but they just assign a number that there's an average amount of employees to those businesses. And I think that this is where it's coming from, right, Dan? So go ahead, could you finish the thought? I just wanted to explain to everybody what this birth-death model is that attempts to capture these small businesses that they're not surveying. But, the ADP does a pretty good job on small business, though.
It does, and ADP has been showing that has by far been the weakest sector, which some of the latest numbers was a loss of around 120,000 jobs for small businesses. But yet the BLS, still overstating things with the birth death and showing, somewhere around 400,000 job gains in one of the recent months from that birth death model. But what's going to happen going forward? Because if we look Q1 over Q1 with the QCW, there was a 52% overstatement. Now Q2 over Q2 from the BLS's final numbers, 73%. But what the QCEW is showing us is from January of June of 2025, the first half, 6 months of the year, there's only 28,000 jobs, but that is before the labor market, even according to the BLS, has really started to take a turn for the worse, because we've started to see some negative job growth. And if you look at the unemployment rate, June it was 4.1%, but every single month after that, it has gone up to now 4.6%. But the real point to look at going forward to show that this is likely going to get worse is that the birth-death model has added 611,000 jobs since June. Just
so
over
that's added to the. Now this comes into the household survey, okay? But so it's a little bit different, apples and oranges, but yet a lot of this goes into the business survey.
And clearly, we're going to continue to see revisions here, because that over the 5 months that we've had these numbers, it's overstated jobs by 122,000.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty stunning that the birth-death model is such a big culprit, and yet nothing's being done. But yet, nothing to see here as far as the Fed's members are concerned. Some of them are acknowledging this, but guys, a lot of the Fed members are not even willing to accept this.
Yeah, I mean, not that long ago, Jerome Powell was saying that the labor market was solid. Thankfully, he's really started to come around and change his tune over the last month or two. But then you have the complete opposite with Austin Goolsbee. Earlier this year, he was concerned about the labor market, but now he's saying that it's stable. And I mean, you guys saw the chart of the unemployment rate. I don't know about you, but I would not call that stable.
And Beth Hammock, she's saying that the labor market is softening, but it's not that bad. And remember that she votes in 2026. And Jeff Schmidt, he says the labor market is in balance. So you wonder what they're looking at.
Yeah, and clearly those two Fed members are probably going to vote for pauses, at least in the first few meetings, until we get a next Fed chair. Maybe they can sway their outlook.
Yeah, guys, remember, Schmidt and Goolsbee dissented, and again, their comments on the labor market, as Jake and Diana pointed out, don't jive with what the facts are. It's irrefutable when you see what's going on here.
All right, so that's kind of what I wanted to cover as far as their data and stuff like that they've come up with. And when they're talking about a lot of this Fed stuff, it is getting really serious, because the only way to keep a recession from happening when these numbers start to snowball like this is to drop interest rates, and they are way behind the 8 ball on that. They're way behind where they should be on interest rates. We should be at least 1% lower on the interest rates by now, and that's all the interest rates. That's the short term and long term, should be at least 1% lower by now. They're so far behind, and they're talking about maybe having a pause in the early part of the year because these members don't know what they're doing, unfortunately. And so they're just we basically need a new Fed, and we do get a new Fed chair in May, and at that point things will probably start to turn around, but by then it's going to be too late when it comes to recession. So the good news is that if a recession does happen, then they don't have a choice. At that point, they have to start cutting. The problem is a lot of times the recession starts 3 to 6 months before they know that you're in a recession. So that's why it can get really bad before anything good comes out of it. But once the recession happens, they're going to have to start lowering a lot faster. Right now, they're only predicting 2 to 3 rate cuts for 2026. I think they're way off on that. I think we're going to see at least 1.5 to 2% in rate cuts for 2026, because they're not going to have a choice when the recession numbers start to snowball. They're going to have to start dropping. And the reason I'm not saying the number of drops, because usually when you say a number of drops, you're talking about 25 basis points per drop. I think we could see them start to have some 50 basis point drops in the latter part of next year, because they're trying to catch up, because they're so far behind on where they should be, and they're trying to get the economy restarted. So that's what I'm thinking. There's also a lot of other stuff going on that's leading to a lot of the job loss, which is AI, like it or not, AI starting to take jobs away from people, and AI should eventually create some new jobs as well, but in the meantime, a lot of companies are starting to go to AI to try to get rid of jobs and try to save money. And to some degree, these companies don't realize that AI isn't really ready for that yet. So we could see them hire some people back when they realize that AI can't do everything that a human can do. So anyway, that's a lot of what's going on right now that I wanted to go over here in some detail. And for the most part, the one good thing, like I said, that could come out of this is in the latter part of next year, we could see the rates really start to drop. Right now we are, starting to get kind of below that 6% interest rate range on some of the 30-year mortgages, especially the government mortgages. And I think we could see that in the middle part of next year, we could see that potentially drop to under 5%. And by the end of next year, it's a possibility it could go under 4%, just because if we go into a recession, especially if the recession looks like it's going to be kind of bad, they're going to have to drop fast. And, we could see it go under 4% by the end of next year as a possibility. Now, there's no guarantee of that. That's just kind of what I'm seeing here on the surface with the jobs numbers. If the jobs were to turn around or something, or if inflation gets bad again or something like that and goes back up, there's a balancing act the Fed has to do between inflation and jobs. The problem is that when you have inflation rising and you have unemployment rising, then you have a real big problem. And then it's like, what do? You have to sort of pick your poison there, because usually if you're raising the interest rates, or if the interest rates are higher, then that is going to maybe cause more unemployment, but it's also going to cause the inflation numbers to come down. If inflation numbers are still going up, then what do? So that's the problem that they're going to have. They're going to have this balancing act, and we have to hope that inflation cooperates and that inflation continues to be stable or come down while the job numbers are getting worse and worse. And if that happens, then you're going to see them really start cutting rates more aggressively at some point next year. And I'm thinking probably, like I said before, they're looking at pausing maybe early in the year, but I think by spring or summer, the job numbers are going to look bad enough that they're going to be like, okay, we have to do something here, and they're going to start being a little bit more aggressive with their cutting. We might even see some 50 basis point cuts in the latter part of the year, which is what I would kind of expect at this point. So especially if it's looking like we're in a recession, because they won't know we're in a recession by summer, but some of the numbers may look like we could be, and as a result they may decide to start being a little bit more aggressive. So anyway, that's what I wanted to go over here before the holiday. Hang in there, and it's still a good time to refinance right now. If you've got an interest rate in the 7 somewhere, then it's probably still a good time to refinance. Some people who are refinancing now will probably refinance again within a year or two. It depends on what happens in the market, obviously. I always think you want to drop your interest rate by at least 1%, sometimes 1.5%, but it depends on the size of the mortgage. So the larger the mortgage you have, the less of a drop you need for it to make sense. If you have a smaller mortgage like 150 or 200,000, then I always try to get people at least a 1.5% drop before it makes sense. But if you're in a higher mortgage like 400,000, 500,000, then sometimes 0.75 to 1% would make sense for you. So anyway, that's what I wanted to go over really quickly. If anybody has any comments or questions, certainly let me know. Like I said, this will probably be my last post prior to the Christmas holiday, and then next week I might make another post after the holiday weekend or something like that, depending on what's going on in the market. I don't expect anything to happen with rates right now going into the holiday. We might see something happen next week, but we've got another holiday coming up, so it may not be until the new year before we really see much movement in rates at this point. That's pretty much it. I hope you have a great holiday, and if you need anything, just let me know. Thanks.